present economic situation, as well as how he really looks at contributing as President CII to this entire agenda of working with CII and leading the Indian industry through CII. So over to you, Dinesh. Thank you.
If I may, I'll go to the podium. Thank you, CB, and good morning to all of you. I know some of you, and I'm sure during the course of this year, I'll get to know the others and get to interact with all of you. I think I can still wish you good morning and a very great pleasure to interact with you today. Obviously, this year is a very important year for many reasons. One is obviously the fact that India is the G20 leader. We have to deliver a successful B20, and I would say the entire world is looking at India. I think in the last few years, and especially so in the last year, I would say the significant focus on India and the opportunities which therefore arise have become even more, I would say, important for us. Obviously, CII has been working with the government not only to look at how we can bring India into the global supply chains, but also to make sure we have the necessary support from the investors to fund this growth going forward. So in that background, I thought I will take you through a very short presentation, after which obviously we will have the question and answers following through. So I have broadly divided this into three buckets. One is from a macroeconomic outlook. I would say the gist of it you can well understand considering what you have seen in today's newspapers and the coverage of what has happened as of for March 23. Of course, how do we work on the continued thrust on the reforms? How do we partner with the government in that? And specifically, what do we see as the opportunities for driving growth? And I want to make clear that we are not just talking about growth for the next year, but also for the growth going forward, because that's, I think, an important CII agenda to start to continue to plan for the future as we work in the immediate actions to be done in the short term. So if I look at the macroeconomic outlook, I'm not going to take too much of time to cover each aspect of it because I think it's been well reported. But I think this is a very important point we are making here. We do believe that we can be actually reasonably optimistic. And if you look at business as usual, we believe we are looking at a 6.5% growth. And at least my belief, and I would say many of the members of CII are actually cautiously optimistic to be looking at a 6.7% growth is what we hope. Of course, we have put on the right side what we believe as assumptions which need to happen to make sure that we can look at the 6.7%. I think if you look at from a domestic scenario, and I'll cover that a little bit later, I think we can be much more sanguine, but obviously we can't control what's going to happen from the global scenario side. And of course, we do hear about what is the monsoon issue, but having said that, I'm not a technical person, but still the El Nino is getting offset by the Indian Ocean dipole and also what they call as a Julian-Madden oscillation. Today's newspaper, I read that from 14th of June, that's most likely to come through. So the third point also, I think, can be taken care of. Last but not the least, obviously, this government has really walked the talk, so we believe the infra spend will be something which will help us going forward. The next slide is even more interesting. If you really look at, leaving aside the COVID year, we have had between 12 to 20 a rate of growth of 6.6%. We believe, and obviously there are various actions which need to be taken, but like I said, looking at it from a forward-looking lens, we believe we can get well above the 7.5% rate of growth. So we could look at 7.8% as the next 5 to 10 years rate of growth. Why do we believe so? I think, as I said, the key focus which India has received from the global interest and the fact that this government has set the reforms agenda well and truly ingrained into various activities which has happened, we do believe that there is a great opportunity for us to seize this initiative and reach this level. And just to give you an idea, if we are looking at our 7.7% per annum growth, we are speaking about a 9 trillion economy by 2030-31. And of course, that reaches 40 trillion by 2047. And why 2047 is important, obviously I'll talk about when you look at our my theme for the year and the years ahead. So if you look at from that background, I think it's not just the question of what is happening at the domestic level, but also the opportunities which the global world is presenting to us, which gives us, as I said, an opportunity to be looking at this rate of growth. The next one is something well known to all of you, but it is important to note that this kind of a structural reforms agenda has helped us to be not only the fastest or the highest growing economy in the current scenario, but we believe that can be sustained going forward as well. We did hear this data, but I'm repeating it. It is a 15% of the global growth is being contributed by India, which I think is a significant difference from what has been there in the past. So all the, I would call it the platform or the ingredients which are necessary to make this happen are very much there, and we believe we have an opportunity to further sustain and build on this. So why do we believe this? I mean, if you look at the corporate balance sheets, and this is again something known to all of you, I'm sure, I think we have had maybe the strongest period post-COVID of consolidation of balance sheets. So the deleveraging has happened, and later I will speak about what we believe this is resulting in when it comes to commitments on capex. But also, if you look at from the government capex as well as the commitment to the infrastructure, I think this is at its highest. And this is going to result in, I would call it the virtuous cycle. The virtuous cycle is infrastructure funding, domestic, therefore domestic demand going up, and as domestic investments come in, more export opportunities arise. And if you look at the examples, you will see many of the global majors who have come in have actually come in for the domestic market, then made India an export hub. So that, I think, is the virtuous cycle which we can really benefit from going forward. Obviously, the various schemes, and I think Gati Shakti, for example, is something which is very clearly thought through in terms of how the national infrastructure pipeline is going to work, and it is obviously bringing in the states into this. And as we see more and more visibility of that, you will see further thrust on the infrastructure going forward as well. Last but not the least, I think the financial system is completely adequately capitalized. In fact, the government has not needed to fund any further equity into any of the banks in the last 2 years. And most importantly, the asset quality is its highest level. And in fact, I think maybe you will find that opportunities for taking risk will further increase for the banks going forward. Again, this is another big benefit, I would call it, as you would have seen, and that's why I said a little bit of the masala has been removed from what you saw yesterday. The fact is that inflation is coming down, and we believe, at least in our survey as well, that while there is the risk of the monsoon, and like I said, the El Nino getting offset by some of the other local actions is what we believe we could really result in. So from our view, we actually are recommending that RBI actually shift the stance to neutral, which also helps the perception of how Indian industry and Indian economy is perceived, considering where we are, or that we are better placed than the rest of the world in terms of the inflation expectations. Equally, if you look at the CII annual survey, which we do, we found that nearly 72% of the CEOs expect that inflation will moderate and it will range between lesser than 5%. So that, I think, is a very important factor from how we see this as being benign support. And while we do understand the necessary actions had to be taken, we believe going forward, this will be a further tailwind for us. The other element is with regard to investment, and as you can see here, post the COVID period, we have again come back, and as you can see, we have attracted the necessary funding from overseas to support as the domestic investment or domestic savings and the investment have actually gone the other way around, but still we have been able to manage our growth better. And I think the highest percentage we have had was 33.9% in 2017-18, and we believe we will come close to that or even exceed that in this year and going forward. So all of this again build that virtuous cycle which I mentioned to you earlier. On the what is the impact on government capex, and again I will go back to the CII annual CEO survey, and you will be very happy to know that more than 2/3 of the respondents, 66% of them, have actually said that there has been a cost reduction in the way in which they run their business due to the good infrastructure or the capex spend which has taken place. And equally, more than 85% have said that there has been a time benefit, and which is exactly when we go back to logistics cost and the supply chain efficiencies which India has been speaking about, time saving is a crucial factor there. And time saving again is a money value, which I'm sure all of you are aware of. But if you look at, let us say, a port clearance or a road transport, that itself makes a significant difference, what they call inventory on wheels. So these two are even, I would call it, further adding and accentuating the growth story which we spoke about. So to sum up on the macroeconomic points, I think there are obviously, and you heard the CEI today talking about he's become more optimistic or more, the downside risks are getting capped. But if you look at from our view, we believe while there are significant headwinds, we believe the tailwinds to growth outstrip the headwinds. And most importantly, it is the focus of the world, which I think we have to really thank the way in which the reforms have panned out by the government, which has really made us more confident that the tailwinds are there in reality to offset whatever headwinds. And while we do understand global markets are under pressure, we do understand I would call it the excess spending during the COVID period has affected the rest of the world. We are not only cocooned from it by what the government did, and in fact, in a way, we have to congratulate the government that they stood firm in making sure that they didn't throw money, but actually used the money judiciously, which has now allowed them to make sure that the growth rates are continuing to be there. So for us, considering the virtuous cycle, considering the robust demand locally, and I would call it the near short-term issues of the monsoon, hopefully getting offset by the other support, I do believe that private sector investment is also going up, and I'll give you a little bit of data later. So yeah, that I'll just give you right now. Actually, if you look at the project announcements which have been made by the private sector in 22-23, this is improved to 29.1 lakh crore. That is moving up from 14.2 lakh crore. So it's a significant jump, 79% commitment. I'm not saying all of it has happened, but that itself signifies the optimism in terms of why the growth will come up. So this, for me, is finishing the first, I would call it, focus in terms of the macroeconomic reality. The second is obviously the continued thrust on reforms. Obviously, CII has been partnering with the government on this, and we will continue to partner. I think this government, I would say, has introduced maybe a complete range of not only pragmatic, but also transformational reforms. And starting from GST to the various other initiatives and ending with the kind of huge infrastructure spend. And as all of you know, publicly we have stated, exactly the wish list number which we had quoted is what came out in the budget, I think has been something which is giving us a potential opportunity to look at the higher rate of growth, which I mentioned, of between 7 to 8%. And we genuinely believe that this government is capable of further enhancing and working on these reforms, and that's why we are listing out a few of them here. I've given a long list, but out of that, the first 7 or first 8 actually are the key focus areas for us from our perspective. So if you look at, obviously there is this need to build consensus on the major reform imperatives, whether it be on land, labor, power and agriculture. That's something which is important. The second is the financing growth. And that is something which I spoke about. If you really want to get to a 7.5, above 7.5% rate of growth, you will need to be able to have different avenues of funding available for this rate of growth to be achieved. And I've just spoken about 2 here, but obviously we have a long laundry list which we can work with the government side as well. Similarly, as I mentioned, India is very much strongly on the global map. It is not just about trade and investment. It is making sure we capitalize on this opportunity, we seize the time and work on this very hard. And whether we call it as, India for the future or for the immediate benefit of India, I think we have significant actions which are there. Obviously, we know that the FTAs are very much in progress. We have been part of the discussions, but it's important that we can quickly get it done. And most importantly, to work on the services export even further to make that a high growth engine along with the investment promotion agency is something which will really help scale up this and speed up this process. The second set of, I would call it the key initiatives, we have to focus on agriculture. That is, as we would have seen in yesterday's statement, the GVA on agriculture was quite high. And how do we continue to have the productivity improvement in agriculture has got to be a core focus area for us. And whether as industry or in any form the private sector, to be able to work with the sector is necessary to make this a reality. On the energy transition, I am going to cover that a little bit later, but it is a crucial area for us. We have to access the right funding and sustain the growth while we make sure we transition in the right manner possible. I have specific points which I will cover later, therefore I'm not going to talk about this here. On the land, if we are going to get manufacturing significant levels of investments, and we are now speaking about, millions of acres of land being available for the investment to take place and across all the states. Therefore, it is necessary to have the India Industrial Land Bank, and how do we get a national level visibility of this is something which we'll have to focus on. The last 2, I would call it key focus areas for us, and this government has been committed to decriminalization of most of these laws. We have been working with them. The Jan Vishwas bill obviously was a big step forward, but we need to make sure this continues, and we need to make sure that we support the right level of governance being made possible by protecting the personal liability of independent directors, as well as making available a quick settlement mechanism so that you don't have cases hanging on, and which obviously we can have the best practices, so to say, from other parts of the world to make plea bargaining also made possible. Last but not the least, I don't need to repeat this. I think we have moved from ease of doing business to cost of doing business, which I'll cover later, but it is necessary that we have a national level single window system. This is not new. Actually, CII has already recommended many of these, but I'm again stressing them as essential for us to be able to get to the above 7.5% rate of growth, which we wish to be able to achieve. And last but not the least, making sure that we have the GST support made available to make that happen. I have a set of other recommendations, but I'm not going to spend too much time here because the first 8 are the ones which we believe are the ones which can be short-term actions which we can look at. I will not cover the rest in detail, what I would call GST 2.0 or I believe this government is somebody, the center has completely worked or walked the talk on fiscal consolidation, so we don't have a concern with regard to that. But obviously from the state side, how do we make sure that also becomes a reality going forward is something we need to look at. But as I said, these are not immediate focus areas. R&D and of course the labor code is something which we have always been talking about, and making sure we have the enforcing of contracts to support the investments which are going to come. And this is not just from manufacturing sector, this is also the financial investors coming on board, which we'll have to support and make happen. So I'm not taking too much of time on these. And then if I move to what this leads us to, and that's, I would call it the theme for 23-24, we have said that basically we want to build a competitive and sustainable India. And like I said, CII agenda has to go towards the future. And therefore, it is India at 100. We did celebrate India at 75. In fact, we are celebrating India at 75 as we speak because we are finishing in August. But having said that, we now need to look at how we will plan for the next 25 years. And the idea is not to just look at a plan which is, I would call it a long-term plan, but to put it into actionable steps for every 3-year or a 5-year plan to be able to make sure we can develop and work with the government to make that a reality. So that focus will be obviously on growth, and I will speak about a little bit of the opportunities which I see here. But in each of this, if I look at growth, I don't think we are going to get a sustainable level of growth without the manufacturing sector being focused on. We are not going to have a significant competitive services sector unless we are able to make sure that we deliver on new areas of services, whether it be tourism or others, which I'll speak about a little bit later. On the competitiveness side, while the larger corporates may be willing to take on the world, I think it is important that we work with the, I would call it tier 1, tier 2 support areas of MSMEs, of the livelihood businesses, which need to be supported and made ready for the future world as it is. And I think the equally important is the cost of doing business. I think this government has also focused strongly on that. And if I look at the logistics, I'm not talking about logistics as a cost, but logistics as an enabler for the growth of the manufacturing sector, that's got to happen. And that's where the focus from the government on the infrastructure side, and now the utilization of the infrastructure in the best manner possible becomes absolutely essential. One of the core themes which we are obviously working on is making sure, I mean, the globalization and the sustainability are, I would call it, in a way hand in hand, because we are becoming integrated completely into the global economy. But the last two elements here is making sure livelihood becomes a core focus for us. And in livelihood, there are 3 elements to it. One is what I would call as livelihood businesses in themselves. And what do I mean by them? They are businesses which are, I would call it, run as either single owner enterprise, where the owners do not really look at the return on capital employed. They really focus on making sure they have a cash to sustain their livelihood on a regular basis. And there are countless examples of them, starting from a transporter to a retailer to many people who work as a tier 3 supplier in the MSME sector. So if you look at them, there is obviously a responsibility of industry to make sure they continue to grow, they continue to flourish, and that is going to create jobs as we go forward. Similarly, if you look at from supporting the skilling aspect of that, as well as education and healthcare, so that's a core focus for us. Last, which I think is a core theme, and when we speak about decriminalization or about ease of doing business, we have to build the trust. And that's, I think, the core element across the system. And if we can, I would call it, change the perception, and this is going to cut across all, so I will cover that a little bit later, but it impacts each of these. So this is, in a way, the core focus or the core theme for this year. Then this automatically leads into what are the opportunities for driving growth and obviously implementing the theme in the manner in which it helps sustain us. So first is on the sustainability, climate and energy transition. I told you I will cover this a little bit more in detail. So how do we actually prepare a roadmap for the energy transition which will directly, without impacting growth, I will actually put it positively, can it be a catalyst for growth and making sure we can deliver on that? India has already taken the leadership. In fact, the Prime Minister, I would say, made a bold statement of saying, clearly laying out a plan as to when we will be able to reach there. And as we go around the world, you actually hear very clear kudos in terms of that feedback for reaching us. But then we will prepare or look at how we can work on the mobility transition. And obviously this will cover the public transport, what we do with the shared mobility, working with the states to make this happen. And equally, how do we build the ecosystem at the state level to make this into a complete plan which we can implement over the years. And as we build the infrastructure, how do we, what we call as adaptation, meaning are we ready for the kind of climate events which are going to take place? And as we build the infrastructure itself, can we make sure that gets subsumed in the plan and the budgeting exercise for that? The second part of that would be financing the transition. And this is something which I think is a core focus area, not just for India, but I would say many parts of the world, many countries in the world. And this has to be something which we have to work on, whether it be new instruments or whether it be introducing the mechanism of, I would call it, low carbon technologies of coming into India, and equally, how do we have the funding support made for that? And as we do that, we want to make sure that there is no greenwashing. Therefore, how do we get the green taxonomy in place to make that happen across the board? And if you look at the color difference here, how will we actually make sure that this facilitation happens is what we are trying to also cover. And that would be to make sure that we have the sector-specific roadmaps as well as the agreed targets on those sectors. And how do we work with the MSME? I mentioned to you that's a core focus area for us, making sure they are part of the large value chain, but they are supported through this eco-edge mechanism we are going to create, and working with the clusters. And in fact, I think we have already identified more than 50 clusters with which we can work with to make this happen across the board. The second element is obviously the manufacturing side. And as I mentioned, I think whether it is the PLI or the global supply chain focus from India, there have been various efforts to make sure this gets delivered. But I think we will be looking forward to a national mission on advanced manufacturing, and how do we make sure that the domestic manufacturing industry gets integrated into the global value chain, which is something I don't need to repeat, all of you are aware of. As I mentioned, on the MSME side, you can call it as 4.0, but I would call it future-ready MSMEs to make sure that they are ready to face or have the competitiveness to be able to face the global requirements. And as CII, I think we will set the standards to further enhance the quality and consumer safety. I think this government had been focusing on this quite a bit, but CII had taken the lead earlier. And two specific actions which we would like to do is do a sector-specific cost of doing business. And this will be something which will help set the index for us to say that we are continuing to improve, because today sometimes it becomes subjective. And equally, how do we make sure that we have the competitiveness survey in place for us to be able to say, yes, India is more competitive than the rest of the world. I know there have been various studies. In fact, I saw a global study as well coming out. But from CII side, we will be making sure we have that available as well going forward. The third sector, and I think again this has been something which has been, I would say, pushed right from the highest level in the country, and that has been on tourism. I think this is a G20 year. We have the, I would call it, a significant opportunity to create the visibility of India, and as you would have seen, the length and breadth of the country is being covered by various people across the board, whether it be G20 or the B20 events, which I think we are running. So one would be on the national tourism policy and the industry and infrastructure status, which we spoke about, but the aspiration would be to get to close to 30 million international arrivals by 2028. This is also going to facilitate or spawn a different sector growth, which I think the services sector can benefit from. And I believe this will also lead to many of our hospitality chains actually becoming global chains, which they already are, but even becoming bigger because of this opportunity. The last but not the least is making sure that we have the coverage of the ecologically sensitive tourist destinations, and we will cover that. Making sure that there is no over-tourism in these areas. I think it's very important that we have sustainable tourism, And some sectors, I think many of you would have experienced it, at least I have experienced it, when you go to a few cities or a few towns where there is over-tourism, it gets not just harmful, but also gets a negative image of that place. On the disruptive technologies, again, I think I'm quoting to the people who are writing about it. Therefore, for us, it is necessary that we have the right responsible focus on the artificial intelligence side. I mean, yesterday's statements were all, coming thick and fast in terms of how that could be harmful, while we believe there are areas which we can still continue to work on. So we have actually set up AI forum, and we are also making sure that on the semiconductor side, we are setting up a task force to make sure we engage with the government efforts on making this happen at the level. And equally important is going to be preparing the people who are going to be exposed to this for the future. On green hydrogen, again, there is already a machine set up. From CII side, we have set up a green hydrogen machine to work with the government on the standards and regulations. Last but not the least is storage, which I think anyway all of you are aware of. A lot of debate going on, and CII will continue to take the lead in terms of making that happen, because it is something which may not be immediate, but as we progress down the journey of alternative energy, we are going to face challenges in how do we make sure necessary standards are met. And I mean, if you look at any of the developed countries, I think that's a challenge which they are also talking about. So it's not something just we are speaking about. The fifth one is on livelihood. I already mentioned to you about how we really look at this, but it's not just about supporting their livelihood, but also making sure they prosper and continue to grow as India prospers. So there are specific areas on which we want to work with: technology, making sure they have this necessary skills, and like I said, most importantly, the access to finance, which I think is the digital solutions of India have enabled them grow, but now we have to make sure they have even further access to a higher rate of growth possible for that. And on wellness, I think there are, again, a lot of areas on which we can work with, but we need to look at working with the government on the universal access for health coverage is a very core focus for us. The insurance sector has to be supported to make that happen, and that's something which we believe we can speed up further. And we actually will be setting up a task force on Ayurveda to make sure that that becomes mainline or mainframe integrated into the wellness journey, which India has been known for and is looking at making happen here. Again, specific focus on skills. We have been very active in this sector, but we will continue to institute standards for skills which cuts across not just manufacturing, but also various services, and that's a core focus for us. And as you can see here, we will be adding 2 new multi-skilling institutes, and most importantly, we will be covering 20,000 apprentices. So these are all specific tasks which we will work on to make sure we support the livelihood, like I said, of businesses and individuals of different stakeholders with whom we are working with. In fact, I would say the core focus of all of this culminates in what I'm going to show you now finally, which is building trust. I think this is something which is, I would call it core and inherent to what industry stands for. And this is cutting across every stakeholder. It is not just building trust with the government to make, I would call it, laws easier. It is to be able to build trust with every stakeholder with whom we work with. And I mean, as a 4th generation family member, I can tell you, we were brought up in that aspect that industry stands for trust, right? And that's something which CII will set up, and we will set up a task force on building trust, and you'll be very happy to know that it will be actually led by none other than Uday Kotak himself to make sure that that gets implemented right across as a mission on building trust. This will further be enhanced by the community engagement, and as you can see here, I don't want to repeat what has been written here, but this will be on various aspects of community engagement to make sure we deliver value and are able to set this up. On the quality mission, which is 2.0, again, we are going to have a very tall leader take up this responsibility. it will be Sanjeev Puri leading the Quality Mission 2.0. And this will be to make sure that India is ready or gets ready to set the global standards and the global benchmark for the world. And most importantly, to make sure we have the necessary recognition and best awards possible for making sure industry gets recognized for the kind of good work which gets done. Maybe we are already having few sectors, few companies which are already setting the global benchmarks, and how do we get there? And I think in my manufacturing, I forgot to mention that we will have Narendran leading the advanced manufacturing support. So as you can see here, all of the focus is on sustaining the growth while continuing to build the complete stakeholder relationship with the core focus of making industry ready for the future, take the lead, partner the government in all their efforts to make India not just the global manufacturing hub, but the country of choice for the investments for the future. I think with that I come to my end, if I remember right. Yes. So thank you, and happy to take questions in any form which you may follow. Thank you.
Hi, sir. I'm Srivat from Business Line newspaper. So thank you for the great presentation. Wanted to ask you on one particular aspect of your presentation, which is on the recommendation to RBI, right? Where you have suggested that we should look at continuing with a pause, if I read your slide correctly, and also change in stance to neutral. Now, wanted you to elaborate this a bit more and help us understand how long or how prolonged should this pause be, and when do you see the time ripe for RBI to look at a cut in repo rates? And second part of my question, if I may, is on private investments. Now, the narrative that has been going is that the current growth has been largely led by the capex fueled by the central government, and states doing a small bit to support that. Now, can you give us some visibility on where do you see private investments? Do you accept criticism in certain quarters that the real animal spirits of the private sector are missing in the Indian economy? Thank you.
Thank you, Srivats. And actually, let me first quickly answer the first question. I don't know whether you were there when the RBI governor came for our AGM event. I think he was very clear, right? He says that I'm going to be led by what I'm hearing from the global market and from what is going to happen from an Indian context of both from an inflation side. So I think inflation is something which we don't wish, because I think it tends to have a more longer term impact, not just on industry, but also on what I would call the competitiveness of industry, because the cost of doing business increases significantly. So if you look at the inflation, as long as it is under control, then I believe that we have every need or every aspect to be able to make it a stronger reduction, or whatever you want to call that. So that's why I think in the right approach, or the prudent approach, would be to say we pause, wait and see what is going to happen to inflation, what is going to happen to the global world, because I think inflation is not just from an Indian context, as all of us know. It is all happening from the globe. That's the reason why we believe a pause and a neutral stance will be the right sign, rather than, and I think in a way, RBI governor articulated it beautifully. He said, I am going to wait for inflation. Once I know I have it under control, then obviously we can talk about reduction, etc. The second part of the question, I was just looking at the data. So if you look at our CEO survey, which we did, many sectors have now crossed utilization of well above 75%. So if I step back and look at it, I don't want to call it as a criticism or whatever it is, it's a reality, right? So we have had COVID, demand was uncertain, global started coming back, then global went down. So now suddenly we are at a situation where we actually find that capex utilization has crossed in some industries 80%. In most cases, cutting across, if I remember, yeah, this is the first time after what, about 6 years literally. And if you look at from the current, I think we are speaking about across all sectors above 75%. That's why we believe that, and as I mentioned, if you look at the commitment from to a significant increase from 14.2 to 29.1 is a huge commitment which has been made. While I'm not saying all of it will happen or will happen definitely tomorrow, that is the clear signs that private sector utilization and therefore capex will follow or is following. Yes.
Having reached the utilization of 80%, is there visibility of increased demand in the economy for private sector to translate this commitment to investment?
I mean, 100% yes. 100% yes. I mean, I would say every board speaks about it.
Thank you. Sir, I am Manoj Kumar from Reuters News Agency. And first, thank you so much for your detailed presentation, so which is giving us hope and a roadmap for 7.8% growth over the next decade. And we are meeting at a time when we have the wonderful numbers yesterday on the GDP.
That's why I said I was helped by that.
Thank you. So we just wanted to understand, like, so have your perspective. I am asking the question because one, like CII, Mr. Banerjee, you and other chambers have worked for years to have these reforms that we have been talking about, whether it is the GST reforms, Gati Shakti reforms, infrastructure spending by the government, and cut in corporate tax rates earlier. So we have achieved all these things, and it prepares a framework for the coming growth. So wanted to understand, like, so from you, what roadmap you see for the manufacturing sector in the coming decade? Why I am asking this question is that because you might have seen even yesterday's numbers, like our manufacturing still remains an area of concern. We don't have much growth happening, perhaps, in the manufacturing sector, despite the fact that there are many success stories in the sector. PLI scheme is there now. And second is, like, we have this, on the livelihood, you quite mentioned that. We don't have this on the jobs front. There is still an issue. Perhaps like this private consumption is not growing even at 3%. Manufacturing is not growing even at 2%. So is it interlinked? Is there something needs to be done? So how do you see, like, to address these two concerns? Thank you so much.
See, if you look at it, there are two elements to this. First is that is manufacturing a core engine of growth? 100%. And I think I can't belabor it, but if you look at whether it is CII, government, or any other effort, all of it is to make sure that manufacturing leads. There are two elements to manufacturing. One is domestic consumption, another is global supply chain. And as I told you, whichever way we look at it, today India has become talked about in every boardroom in the world in terms of this being part of the global supply chain. And I think CB and I have been hearing this wherever we have gone in terms of the core focus. So to answer your question, is domestic consumption going to support manufacturing? Yes, 100%. But as I said, there are two virtuous, so I'll come to the second part of that. The virtuous cycle I mentioned to you about is that we have had this significant spend on capex and infrastructure. And that causes, I would call it, or it percolates down into the hands of the consumer in different fashion. And some is already happened, some is happening. So we cannot forget that we have come out of COVID when all of the negatives were there, and I don't want to get into the negatives. But therefore, I wouldn't look at the last 2 years or the last 3 years or I would call it even the immediate last 3 months as a precursor of the future. So to answer your question, the focus on manufacturing will continue, the focus on livelihood support will continue, and that's why as CII we are voicing it very clearly that that needs to happen. But I would call it, there is never, I would say we have never had an opportunity to grow manufacturing as we have today. It's an incredible opportunity. Either it's the ease of doing business or the cost of doing business. I mean, let me voice it differently. As a businessman, I can tell you the ease of doing business is at a far different level, and the cost of doing business focus is at a far different level, which I think will lead not just to, like, that's why I'm committing a 7.7 or 7.8% rate of growth, because I believe we have done all the necessary work to make that happen. There will be some lag in catching up, and I don't think we should look at monthly data for that.
If you permit me just to ask a supplementary. So, the share of this manufacturing still remains nearly 17 to 18% in the GDP over the past 1 decade. And we have been talking of at least 25% share in the GDP. So at what time you see so we will be having a manufacturing share in the GDP reaching 25%? Thank you.
You want me to take a guess at a year?
Don't guess at a year so, because we are seeing a 7.8% growth coming. So what share you visualize whether manufacturing will be achieving 25%?
Good question. I would say, I mean, the target is to get to 25% from 16, 17 today to 25. But I think I wouldn't want to hazard a guess and say which year we will reach. But maybe we will do some work on it with our...
in fact, talked about it in the next
5 decade.
2047.
Yeah, 2047 we will be, but I'm saying before we don't. Okay, I think CB is confirming that. So if you look at, definitely by 2047, that's where we should be. But will we be earlier? I don't want to commit till I know for sure.
Thank you.
Nivedita and then
Sir, I'm Nivedita Mukherjee from the Sunday Garden. So you mentioned the projects and the jump in investments. Could you elaborate a little on the areas and the sectors which are seeing a rush of investments, and also on the job front, sir? We've seen lately a lot of our tech biggies laying off people. What's the outlook on the jobs and employment? And there is still a lingering concern that many of the the graduates coming out of the various vocational colleges coming up now and then are not really fitted to the industry 4.0 as we are developing. Could you, share your views on that, please?
It's a very comprehensive question. You're asking for 3 sectors cover. But anyway, very quickly, maybe if I put it that way, sorry, the first part I forgot. You said which sectors? Yeah. So if I look at whether it is steel, whether it is cement, whether it is transport services, in fact, I have that full list with me. If you look at each of them, I think we are now speaking about in excess of 75%. So it is not just one sector. It is cutting across most manufacturing and some of the services sector as well. The second issue is in terms of, obviously manufacturing is going to result in significant employment increase. When an Apple commits to invest in India, it is talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs. So each of these foreign companies who are coming into India are talking about creating jobs not just for India but for the world. I mean, meaning manufacturing for the world. Therefore, I'm not sanguine, but I believe that there is enough opportunity available for us to be able to generate the kind of employment we have. The third aspect of it, the skilling, I think I already mentioned our focus on making sure that we are setting the standards in place. I think it's a question of, it's a chicken or egg. You can always say, people who are coming out of education institutions are not ready. Or you can say industry has to work with the education institutions, and obviously we are seeing good significant growth in that partnerships happen. Can we speed it up? Yes, of course we will speed it up. So I think it's a question of need rather than something happening before the need to make that a reality. We have to be pragmatic. We cannot come in and say, I expect something going to happen 5 years from now, get prepared for it today. So as it happens, we have to keep working, and that's where I think CII's strength is, to make sure that that kind of industry, academia partnership linkages continue to happen and work on it. My mistake, it is 2030 to 31 when we should be looking at 25%. That's why I said there is a study. I didn't have the data with me. CB corrected it. Yeah. Thank you.
In our study, actually what we had pointed out was 2047, we will definitely be above 27%. And 2030-31, we would reach the figure of 25%. That's the model that we had created when we were visioning 2047.
What average growth we are looking at?
So you calculate the average. We are at about, say, 21-22, we were 15.6%.
Yeah, sorry.
Good afternoon, sir. Congratulations. Karishma this side from the India Today group. I think this interaction also comes at a very prestigious time where the provisional estimates have been out, which you've, of course, significantly addressed. My question is an extension of my colleagues on the private capex. Government has set an enthusiastic target of 10 lakh crore. If you could give us some data on what kind of target is the private sector looking at for the year, and in the last 2 years, how has the private capex gone better in terms of your estimates and the targets achieved? I also have a second question, sir. Yesterday, the chief economic advisor, to an extent, sidelined inflation and the El Nino, the both two key challenges that, in fact, we were looking forward to, which, to an extent, you also agree with. Do you see other geopolitical issues, external factors as downside risks to the market sentiment?
Let me answer the second question first, because I have it ready. Have it ready meaning I have I would call it a view, very strong view on that. See, geopolitical is something we cannot control, right? Today, what we know is that there is no further, I would call it, worsening of any wars-like situation, or I would call it a major impact which makes a negative on the our country. If we believe in that, and I already mentioned to you, the good news seems to be, yes, El Nino will be a factor, but we have the Julian-Madden oscillation and also the Indian Ocean dipole, whatever the technical terms are, which may result in the monsoon not going bad. So if I mentioned to you the potential negatives, and I believe that at least currently none of them are visible. So yes, as the country CEA, he has to, I think the word he used was, I'm more optimistic than I was in January. So that is the reality. But at least we believe that we are not having any further visibility or awareness of something which could happen, other than, like I said, any geopolitical actions which none of us can guess. Because I don't think any of us expected a Ukraine war to be there for 18 months. Yeah. So you have the data on that. We don't have the data. That's why I said, give us some time. We will try to answer your question a little bit later. Because we do a survey with the CEOs, but they may not actually give you exactly what is the amount in CapEx. And I mean, obviously, we have the largest member base in the country, but it may not cover every company which is making this.
Sector-wise,
yeah. It will be difficult for us to give it right now. We'll try. 100% on an uptick. I told you, the commitment, if you look at from CMIE data, actually was 14.9 lakh crores last year, which has increased to 29.1 lakh crores this year, which is a 79% increase. Commitment. How much of it is actually translating into full implementation, we won't know, because there may be some delays, lags, whatever it is. But this is official data. So it is moved from 14.9 to 29.1.
Hi, sir. Good afternoon. Danish Anand from CNBC TV 18. This side, sir.
Sorry.
Hi. I have two sector-specific questions. First of all, as far as the auto industry is concerned, as of now, the FAME 2 scheme is not likely to get extended. So, do you think the EV industry will hit a roadblock after this? The kind of sales that we are seeing right now, there might not be that kind of sales. And the second question is on the aviation sector. Currently, we are
On the?
On the aviation sector. You have a great outlook on the tourist inflows in the country, but considering the current environment that is there, we are seeing one of the airline is grounded, and we have none of the full-service carriers in India. So, as far as the development is concerned in the aviation sector, what sort of recommendations would you give to the government?
On the question on mobility, I think, see, we shouldn't confuse EV mobility with only one incentive or whatever it may be, right? So as I already mentioned, for us as CII, the core focus is on the overall planning of that mobility. And if you look at public transport, very important area for making sure that the right things happen. Making sure investments, not just in capacity building of manufacturing, but also in making sure that the usage and the charging infrastructure is built up at the same time. Therefore, net, I don't think one change in FAME scheme is going to affect the EV sector in any form or manner. In fact, I would say it makes the companies also become more competitive and become fit for the future. The second question in terms of aviation, let me put it in two different ways. Is there, forget one airline, look at the kind of orders which have happened from Air India, 470 planes, Indigo. If you look at the commitment to fly globally, and like I mentioned, with the kind of focus on tourism, whichever way we look at it, I think today people are committed to build capacities which will lead us into a high growth area for the future. The focus from the government side on building the necessary infrastructure, whether it be the airports or whether it be the financial support for the airports, I think is significant. Facilitation of passenger movement, the Digi Yatra, implementing that is other area. So I don't think there is any lack of focus on making sure the aviation sector continues to grow. I don't believe as a passenger we are going to be affected by what happens to specific airlines. See, on one side, you can't say that we want the market to determine what the fare should be, on the other side that they are going up, right? I don't think it's a capacity issue which is causing that. Once fares go up, you will find more capacity coming in immediately. I used to go to my hometown, Madurai, and I think today there were, Chennai, Madurai was more expensive than Delhi, Chennai. But today there are so many planes flying to Chennai that rates have come down. So it's a matter of time. I think capacity will flow to where the return is.
Thank you very much. Hi, so this is Girish from Mint. Thank you very much for the very detailed presentation. I would like to draw your attention to our consumption story. One possible weakness that experts have pointed out is that consumption is driven mainly by items consumed by the economically well-off rather than the bottom of the pyramid. Do you see the situation changing and consumption becoming more broad-based later this year?
I don't think any of the data which I see actually points to that in terms of that, consumption is being led only by the higher end of the growth. If you look at, I would call it the aspirational usage of goods has actually gone up significantly. And I think the government has also done enough to protect what I would call the lesser well-off, to make sure that they don't suffer from that perspective. And whether it be infrastructure on railways or if you look at the focus on roads, I think it is going to mean that people movement and aspirational movement of, I would call it, people is not going to suffer. Then buying goods. I don't think any of the sectors reflect that it is only high-end consumption which is taking place. Today, and unless you have data to tell me, I have not seen any data which shows that there is only one sector which is growing, or only the high-end sector is growing and others are suffering. I think that was, a story maybe during COVID, but not now.
Hello, sir.
We'll come back.
Hello, hi sir. Congratulations first of all and thank you for the presentation. I am Bhavya from ET Now. So my first question is regarding the net zero program that CII launched last week at its AGM, and right now also we talked about climate and energy a lot in detail, right? So we talked about infrastructure, we talked about how there can be allocation under PM Gati Shakti towards climate resilient options, right? And we also talked about financing and introduction of new investment instruments that can help. So what sort of partnerships with government and businesses can be seen under net zero program when it comes to helping in the ease of financing when it comes to green energy?
I mean, the way I would look at it is not the government who is going to fund the energy transition in itself, right? So it is got to be significant attraction from both overseas investments and Indian domestic capital flowing into the energy efficiency sectors. For that, obviously, there is a need to, I would call it, start making awareness creation, which I think this government has done a great job of making sure goals are set, and I would call it maybe we have far exceeded or far speeded up beyond anybody's expectation, whether it be from an energy side or from the adoption to EV. So, is there a need for the government to do anything? No. I think it is a question of industry and an opportunity being created for investment to come into that industry. Obviously, the necessary work in terms of a bond scheme or methodology of bringing that investment, we will work with the government. I don't think we are saying the government needs to fund that separately.
Thank you.
Hello, sir. Can I ask you a question? This is a...
Yeah.
Hi, sir. This is Abhishek from CNN News 18. My question is regarding this critical technology that we have been talking about in the recent past, collaborating with US, UK or European Union. So what are the areas that Indian industries are looking at in terms of having a collaboration with in critical technologies with other countries? And while Prime Minister will be in USA in the coming weeks and be a huge diplomatic engagement, as an industry body, how are you looking forward to a Prime Minister's visit to USA?
Sorry, I didn't get the first part on what technology?
Critical technology transfers. So what are the areas, what are the areas that Indian industry is ready to collaborate on critical technologies with its US counterpart and European counterparts?
No. So, I mean, I don't see a challenge in that, meaning in the sense that obviously from industry perspective, there are two options, right? Either you get the potential owner of those technologies to come and invest in India and make in India and make it for the rest of the world, which is also fine. Or obviously they have to find partnerships with Indian companies to be able to make that happen. I think from an Indian industry side, we are all for it. We are looking forward to more such opportunities. As you would have seen, we spoke about green hydrogen, we spoke about semiconductor. So the opportunity is there. It is for us to capitalize to make sure that we see this. I think again I go back, in a way, this is the perfect time for us to make that happen.
Also, sir, regarding Prime Minister's visit as an industry body, how do you look forward to Prime Minister's visit to US?
Always, every visit of the Prime Minister results in more business opportunities coming. So we look forward to more such opportunities coming there. I mean, we don't have a specific ask every time somebody goes, right? We follow up and make sure it happens. In fact, recently in Australia, we followed up on what are the various cooperation agreements which had been signed. Sorry,
so, basically, of course, I mean, there are three areas. Number one, of course, we see a large potential of, we talked about manufacturing earlier, manufacturing investments coming into India from the US. Some of it has already, one has seen big announcements. You talked about also critical areas, so we will actually be focusing on many critical areas, be it AI and quantum or telecom, semiconductor, of course, very, very importantly. We are also pretty much interested in the space and the biotech sector, and all of it, there is so much of technology and so much of technology which can flow in, with so much of opportunity in India, there is demand. So all of it is something that we would expect in. The other very important point is you have a very strong Indian investment also in the US. So that's again something which has helped us create a very good brand of India. So I think the brand image of India, which is doing well, we would look forward to that getting even more enhanced. We would look at these technologies where we can have more collaboration, and we will look at much more of investments coming into, especially in the manufacturing sector, large scale, on these areas.
Sir, Himanshu Shekhar from NDTV. Yesterday, of course, the GDP figures has come, were of course better than what were estimated earlier. You have said that CII expects inflation to moderate this year to below 5%. Now, do you now also expect that in the coming year, on the repo rate front, RBI should take a relook at it now, since that you are projecting that inflation would be within the RBI's targets?
So, I mean, I actually was alluding to the same point earlier when I said that the RBI governor, when he came for our annual day, was very clear. He said that it is essential for him to be led and go by what he sees at the ground level, right? So I think right now what we are saying, and that's obviously a quarter or a half year look, is to make sure that we don't have a challenge in terms of the immediate, have a pause, right? After that, will we look for more positive? If the good news continues, yes, 100% that would be what we would. But is there an immediate recommendation? No, I think prudency demands that we wait and watch. Because inflation can be negative, not just for public, but also for the industry.
Hello, sir. Hi, Pallavi from Money Control this side. So we talked about sustainability, and you told us that there's a need for India to accelerate its FTAs with UK and EU, among others.
FTAs.
Right. So there's a concern there regarding the carbon border tax. Does industry see that as a concern, or is industry moving forward to adopting the norms that EU has put down?
See, I don't think we should look at it as EU has put down certain norms. I think India has taken the lead with regard to sustainability. So the way I would look at it is Indian industry will also quickly adopt to whatever is required, and I repeat it, what we would expect from as India standards. So that is one aspect of it. The second, I think there is a time frame within which that is going to happen. So by that time we should be more than ready, is how I would look at it. But I don't wish to comment on what's going to be, 3 years down the road.
But is that a concern for the industry at the moment?
I mean, we need to understand exactly how that will get worked out. I think in the next 2-3 months we will have visibility of that, because for October 1st is when the rules come into effect, by which time we will know what impact we will have.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and hope to see you soon, sometime soon.